Isaiah's vision of a messianic age when all the nations shall go up to Jerusalem to learn the law of God was no less profound than the dream of Martin Luther King. Of course, Isaiah would not live to see his messianic vision come to fruition, just as Dr. King sensed that he would never see the fulfillment of his own dream. He declared that God has allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. The original prophet Isaiah, for all his power and influence, not to mention the lasting legacy he would leave to this day, seems to have disappeared without a trace around the turn of the 7th century BCE. There's an ancient tradition that he ran afoul of the successor of Judah's good king Hezekiah, the wicked Manasseh, who, we are told in the book of 2 Kings, shed innocent blood. Hercule Poirot here, at the request of Agatha Christie. A good detective might ask, is it possible that Isaiah was murdered at his hands? One ancient Jewish non-biblical source, the martyrdom of Isaiah, relates that the prophet was tied to a tree trunk and sawn in two. The text reads, quote, Manasseh brought carpenters and had them saw in two the cedar wood until Isaiah's blood flowed forth. While the book is considered pseudepigrapha, that is, false writing, and its veracity questioned, there must have been such a story about Isaiah's demise that was taken seriously for centuries. Even the New Testament book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 37, speaking of righteous people across the centuries, appears to cite it. We read, quote, they were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword, unquote. Was that you, Isaiah? However Isaiah died, no other Israelite prophet arose for another 50 to 75 years. But then came Zephaniah, who, like Isaiah, boasted a distinguished pedigree, being descended from the house of David. In the tradition of the social justice warriors who went before him, he doesn't just castigate the foreign lands round about, in this case Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Ethiopia, and Assyria, but he points an accusing finger at Judah itself. It's a period of national introspection in the days of King Josiah, who is depicted as a reformer conducting a very personal war on idolatry. In tandem with Josiah's reforms, he too becomes a zealous warrior against idolatry. He promises national salvation, but in declaring that the day of the Lord is coming, he does something radical. He turns the concept on its head, proclaiming that it will be a day of darkness, not light. He paints a thoroughly fearsome picture. Karov Yom Hashem HaGadol, Karov Umaher Meod, Kol Yom Hashem Mar, Tzoreach Sham Gibor, Yom Evra Hayom Hahu, Yom Tzara Umetzuka, Yom Shoah Umeshoah, Yom Choshech Ve'afela, Yom Anan Ve'arafel, Yom Shofar Utrua, Al He'arim HaBetzorot, Al Hapinot HaGvohot. Zephaniah takes his social critique a step further than Israel's first social justice warrior, Amos, Because while Amos said that God will deal with Israel once he's through dealing with the pagan nations, Zephaniah starts with Israel. That's where judgment begins. And even before the judgment of Judah and Jerusalem, the earth itself will be smitten.
אסוף אסף כל מעל פני האדמה נאום השם. אסף אדם ובהמה, אסף עוף השמיים וגדי הים, והמכשולות את הרשעים, והכרתי את האדם מעל פני האדמה.
Does failure in the area of ethics and social justice impact the whole of creation? Is it that important? As religious scholar Adele Berlin noted, quote, "The religious failure of Judah means the end of the world order," unquote. But there's an interesting catch here. Israel's infractions are precisely related to improper observance of religious ritual, the same rituals presumably jettisoned, at least according to some scholars, by the prophets of the previous century. So again, we present the issue, is social justice an end in itself, trumping shallow religious ritual? Or does social justice, according to the prophets, flow forth directly from properly observed ethical monotheism, rituals and all? You might call it, which came first, the chicken or the egg issue. But it's a serious issue on which scholars take up sides. In any case, the general theme and prophetic program of Zephaniah are remarkably similar to that of the prophet Micah, namely, that what God requires is just action, faithfulness to one's commitments, and humility.
בקשו את השם כל ענבי הארץ, אשר משפטו פעלו. בקשו צדק, בקשו ענווה, אולי תסתרו ביום אף השם.
There's certainly a persistent prophetic tradition of ethical teaching and protest against social abuse that's remarkable for any ancient society and very much present in Israelite society. Upholding the rights of small farmers, for example, is a value found in abundance in the Deuteronomic Law Code, and has led to the theory that Deuteronomy was actually composed around the time of King Josiah and the prophet Zephaniah, and ascribed backwards to Moses. The idea being it's just too socially progressive to have been composed by the great lawgiver, since the Israelites were wandering in the desert for 40 years. Of course, no one can prove such a theory, so again, scholars and critics choose up sides. Then there is the ongoing issue of whether a militancy of sorts is connected with the vision of the prophets. Does being a social justice warrior mean that you can't be a regular warrior? Does it mean you're a pacifist? In modern times, we can think of FDR, President Roosevelt, who called the nation to arms to put down fascist tyranny, declaring, "The American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory." Now, consider the words of Zephaniah, who declared what will happen after the pagan nations have chastised Israel.
כי מואב כסדום תהיה, ובני עמון כעמורה, ממשק חרול, ומכרה מלח ושממה, עד עולם. שארית עמי יבזום, ויתר גוי ינחלום.
He's basically saying that lost territory will be reclaimed by force of arms. He goes on to say that the surviving pagans will cast away their idols.
נורא השם עליהם, כי רזה את כל אלוהי הארץ, וישתחוו לו איש ממקומו, כל איי הגויים.
But then the prophet turns again on Jerusalem.
הוי מוראה, ונגלה העיר היונה, לא שמעה בקול, לא לקחה מוסר. נביאיה פוחזים ואנשי בוגדות, כהניה חיללו קודש.
But which Jerusalem is this? The one still defiled by the evil king Manasseh? In which case, it's one more aspect of a larger war on idolatry. Or the one in the process of being cleaned up by Josiah, in which case the prophet is little impressed by the proper observance of religious ritual, including the temple cult. Again, does social justice trump ritual or flow out of it? But one thing is clear. Zephaniah's view of the distant future glows with hope.
שארית ישראל לא יעשו עוולה, ולא ידברו כזב, ולא יימצא בפיהם לשון תרמית, כי המה יראו ורבצו, ואין מחריד.
Having begun with a terrifying vision of the end of the world, the book ends with a joyful hymn to Jerusalem and a promise of return from exile.
בעת ההיא אביא אתכם, ובעת קבצי אתכם, כי אתן אתכם לשם ולתהילה, בכל עמי הארץ, בשובי את שבותיכם לעיניכם.
Could the prophet have somehow foreseen all of this well over a century before it happened? Or was this part added by later editors who wanted to make it appear as though Zephaniah had a crystal ball? It's all about choosing up academic sides, and the rest is history.